The blizzard came down from the Rockies like a white wall of fury, and Jacob Thornton stood at the edge of town, watching the snow devour the mountain pass, knowing his wife was waiting at their cabin 10 miles north with empty flour barrels and a hope in her eyes that he would not let die. He was a man built from the wilderness itself, 6 feet 4 inches of solid muscle, earned through years of trapping beaver and hauling timber, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world and arms thick as lodge poles. His dark hair fell past his collar, perpetually windswept and touched with early frost despite his 28 years, and his beard framed a jaw that looked carved from granite. The trading post owner had tried to convince him to wait out the storm, but Jacob had simply loaded 4 50-pound sacks of flour onto his shoulders and walked into the white hell without another word. The wind cut through his buckskin jacket like invisible knives, but Jacob kept moving, one boot in front of the other, following a path he knew by heart, even when he could barely see 5 feet ahead. Sarah was waiting. That thought alone kept his legs pumping through drifts that rose to his thighs, kept his back straight under the 200 pounds of flour he carried. She had asked for so little in their 2 years of marriage, his sweet Sarah with her golden hair and eyes the color of summer sky. All she wanted was to bake bread, to fill their small cabin with the smell of something warm and good, to create a home in this brutal wilderness they had chosen together. They had met in the spring of 1877 in a settlement called Timber Creek, nestled in the Colorado Rockies where civilization met the wild unknown. Jacob had come down from his trap lines to sell pelts, his pack horse loaded with beaver and mink, his pockets empty of everything but hope. He had noticed her immediately, standing outside the general store with a basket of eggs she was trying to sell, her calico dress faded but clean, her face tilted toward the sun like a flower seeking light. She had been staying with her aunt and uncle, helping them run their small farm after her parents had died of fever the previous winter back in Kansas. At 19, she had been alone in the world except for distant relatives who tolerated her presence but showed little warmth. Jacob had bought every egg in her basket, though he had no use for so many. She had looked at him with surprise and gratitude, and when she smiled, something in his chest had cracked open, like ice breaking on a spring river. He had been living alone for 5 years since leaving his father's failing ranch in Wyoming, and he had forgotten what it felt like to want something beyond survival. But looking at Sarah, he remembered. He remembered dreams and softness and the possibility that life could be more than just enduring. He had courted her with the awkward intensity of a man who had spent too long with only animals for company. He brought her fresh trout from the streams, wildflowers from the high meadows, and once a deer hide he had tanned soft as silk. She had accepted his attentions with a quiet joy that suggested she had been waiting for someone to see her, really see her, as more than just an extra mouth to feed. Her aunt and uncle had been suspicious of the mountain man who came calling, but Sarah had defended him with unexpected fierceness. "He is kind," she had told them, her small hands clenched in determination. "He is honest, and he works harder than any man I have ever known. He does not drink or gamble, and when he looks at me, he sees me. Not a burden, not a servant, but me." They had married in June, with wildflowers woven through Sarah's hair, and the preacher barely able to hear their vows over the rushing sound of the creek. Jacob had built their cabin with his own hands over the course of 3 months, choosing a spot sheltered by tall pines where a spring provided fresh water year-round. It was 10 miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only by a rough trail that wound through the mountains, but it was theirs. Sarah had made it beautiful with the small touches Jacob never would have thought of. Curtains sewn from flour sacks, wildflowers in a jar on the table, a braided rug by the fireplace made from scraps of fabric she had saved. She loved to bake. Her mother had taught her, she said, back when life had been gentler, and they had lived in a real house with a real kitchen. In their cabin, she made do with a Dutch oven and whatever supplies Jacob could haul up from town, but she never complained. She made biscuits and cornbread, and once, for his birthday, a cake sweetened with honey and studded with dried berries. But what she truly longed to bake was bread, proper yeast bread like her mother used to make, with a golden crust and soft interior that could turn a simple meal into something special. The problem was flour. It was expensive and heavy, and the trip to town was long and could be dangerous depending on the season. Jacob made the journey once a month when weather permitted, but by the end of each month, their supplies would run low. Sarah never asked for more, never demanded anything, but Jacob had seen the way she looked at the empty flour barrel, the longing in her eyes quickly hidden behind a smile when she noticed him watching. This trip had been planned for weeks. Winter had set in early this year, and their supplies were running lower than usual. Jacob had left 3 days ago, intending to be back within 2 days, but storms had delayed him in town. He had spent the extra time working odd jobs to earn money for supplies, hauling lumber and splitting wood for townspeople too old or soft to do it themselves. He had earned enough for 4 full sacks of flour, along with other necessities, salt, sugar, coffee, and a small bag of raisins that would make Sarah's eyes light up with delight. Then the blizzard had rolled in, and suddenly no one thought he should leave. The trading post owner, a grizzled man named Henderson who had survived 30 years on the frontier, had looked at the darkening sky and shaken his head. "That is a 3-day blow coming, Thornton. You would be a fool to head out now. Wait it out here in town." But Jacob had thought of Sarah alone in the cabin. He had left her with plenty of firewood and smoked meat, and she knew how to handle a rifle if predators came sniffing around, but he had promised to be back yesterday. She would be worried. More than that, he had told her he would bring flour, and he could not stand the thought of disappointing her. Could not stand the thought of her hope fading when he did not return, of her measuring out the last cups of cornmeal and resigning herself to another month of making do. So he had tied the flour sacks together with rope and hoisted them onto his shoulders, 2 on each side, balanced in a way that distributed the weight. 200 pounds was heavy, but Jacob had carried heavier loads through worse terrain. He had spent years hauling beaver pelts out of remote valleys, had once carried a wounded trapping partner 15 miles to a doctor, had built his cabin by carrying every log and stone himself. His body was a tool he had honed through relentless use, and he trusted it to get him home. The first 2 miles were brutal, but manageable. The wind came from the west, driving snow directly into his face, forcing him to keep his head down and navigate by instinct and memory. His world narrowed to the small space in front of his boots, to the rhythm of his breathing, to the burn in his shoulders and thighs. The cold was intense, the kind that found every gap in clothing and dug in deep, but Jacob had dressed in layers: wool union suit, flannel shirt, buckskin jacket, and a heavy coat made from a bear he had killed 2 winters ago. His hands were wrapped in thick mittens, his head covered by a fur hat with ear flaps. The trail began to climb after the first mile, winding up through pine forest where the trees offered some protection from the wind. Jacob's breath came harder now, white clouds in the frigid air, and sweat began to form beneath his layers despite the cold. The flour sacks seemed to grow heavier with each step, the rope cutting into his shoulders even through his thick clothing. He adjusted his grip, redistributed the weight, and kept moving. He thought about Sarah to keep himself going. Thought about the way she looked in the morning with sunlight streaming through the cabin window, her hair loose around her shoulders as she made coffee. Thought about her laugh, which came more easily now than it had when they first married, as if she was slowly learning to trust happiness. Thought about the way she fit against him at night, her head on his chest, her breathing slow and peaceful in sleep. She had told him last month that she thought she might be carrying a child, though it was too early to be certain. Her eyes had been bright with hope and fear when she whispered the words, and Jacob had felt his heart expand with an emotion too big for words: a child, a family. Everything his own childhood had lacked, he could give to this new life. Everything Sarah had lost, they could build again together. If she was pregnant, she would need good food. She would need to stay strong and healthy. She would need bread, proper bread, not just cornmeal mush and biscuits. The thought pushed Jacob forward, even as the 3rd mile stretched before him like an eternity. The storm intensified as he climbed higher. The wind now howled through the trees with a voice that sounded almost human, and the snow fell so thickly that Jacob could barely see the dark shapes of the pines around him. He knew these woods intimately, had trapped every valley and ridge for years, but in the whiteout conditions, landmarks became impossible to identify. He relied on the slope of the land, on the feel of the trail beneath his boots, on an internal compass built from experience and necessity. His body began to protest in earnest around the 4th mile. His shoulders screamed with pain, the muscles burning with the constant strain of supporting 200 pounds. His thighs quivered with each step, especially when the trail grew steeper. His lungs ached from breathing frigid air, and despite his layers, he could feel the cold beginning to seep deeper, looking for weakness. The sweat that had formed earlier now felt like ice against his skin. Jacob stopped once to rest, setting the flour sacks down carefully to keep them out of the snow and leaning against a large pine. He allowed himself 2 minutes, counting them out in his head, letting his breathing slow and his muscles recover slightly. He pulled out a piece of jerky from his pocket and chewed it mechanically, forcing himself to eat even though his stomach was clenched tight with effort. He needed fuel, needed to keep his body running. As he rested, he remembered the day he had asked Sarah to marry him. They had been sitting by the creek, and he had been so nervous his hands were shaking. He was not a man comfortable with words, had never learned the art of pretty speeches, but he had tried his best. "I know I am not much," he had said, his voice rough with emotion. "I live hard and I do not have money or fancy things to offer. But I can promise you this. I will work every day to make you happy. I will protect you with everything I have. I will build you a home and fill it with everything you need. You will never be alone again, and you will never doubt that you are loved." Sarah had looked at him with tears streaming down her face, and for a terrible moment he had thought she was going to say no. But then she had thrown her arms around his neck and whispered, "Yes," against his ear, and Jacob had felt like the richest man in the territory. He had kept that promise every day since. Every deer he shot, every cord of wood he split, every improvement he made to the cabin was about keeping that promise. And this journey through the blizzard, this brutal 10-mile trek with 200 pounds of flour on his shoulders, was just another way of saying what he had said by the creek. "You are loved. You will never go without. I will carry any burden to see you smile." Jacob pushed away from the tree and lifted the flour sacks again, grunting with effort as he settled them back into position. The rope had rubbed his shoulders raw despite his thick clothing, and he could feel the dampness that might be blood, or might just be sweat. It did not matter. He had 6 more miles to go. The 5th and 6th miles were a kind of meditation in suffering. Jacob's mind began to float, detaching slightly from his body's complaints. He existed in a small bubble of sensation, the crunch of snow under his boots, the howl of wind, the weight on his shoulders, the burning in his lungs. Time lost meaning. He might have been walking for hours or days. The world was nothing but white and cold, and the next step, and then the next, and then the next. He thought about his own parents, about the hardscrabble ranch in Wyoming where he had grown up. His father had been a hard man, quick with his fists and slow with affection, beaten down by too many failed dreams and too much cheap whiskey. His mother had been worn thin by poverty and disappointment, old before her time. They had both died when Jacob was 23, his father from a horse accident and his mother from pneumonia 6 months later. And if he was honest, he had felt as much relief as grief. He had loved them in the abstract way one is supposed to love parents, but he had not liked them much, and he had not wanted to become them. Meeting Sarah had shown him that life did not have to follow that pattern. Hardship did not have to breed bitterness. Isolation did not have to mean loneliness. With her, he was building something different, something better. Their children, if they were blessed with children, would grow up knowing they were wanted and cherished. They would grow up in a home filled with love and the smell of fresh bread. The thought made him smile even as his body screamed for rest. 6 more miles. He could do 6 more miles. The trail grew treacherous as he climbed toward the high pass that would take him over the ridge and down into the valley where their cabin waited. The wind was strongest here, unobstructed by trees, and it hit him like a physical force. Jacob had to lean into it, had to fight for every step, and the flour sacks tried to pull him backward, to overbalance him. One wrong step would send him tumbling down the slope, and if that happened, he would not be getting back up. Not with this load, not in this storm. He moved with exaggerated care, testing each foothold before committing his weight. His feet were starting to go numb in his boots despite the thick wool socks, and his hands had lost most feeling inside his mittens. He recognized the signs of serious cold, knew he was pushing into dangerous territory, but the alternative was turning back or finding shelter and waiting out the storm. Turning back meant another day away from Sarah, Finding shelter meant the same, and besides, he was more than halfway now. It made more sense to push forward than retreat. The 7th mile took him over the pass and onto the downward slope. The wind was less vicious here, blocked by the ridge behind him, but the snow was deeper, in some places rising to his waist. Jacob had to plow through it like a ship through water, using his bulk and momentum to force a path. The flour sacks seemed impossibly heavy now, each one weighing 1,000 pounds. His shoulders had gone past pain into numbness, which was almost worse because he could not tell if he was causing permanent damage. He fell once, going down hard on one knee when his boot caught on a hidden root. The flour sacks slammed against his back and head, and for a moment he just knelt there in the snow, gasping. The temptation to stay down was enormous. His body begged for rest, screamed that he had done enough, that he could set down the burden and sleep for just a few minutes. But Jacob knew that giving in to that temptation would be death. Men who sat down to rest in blizzards did not get back up. He forced himself to stand, using a nearby tree for support, and kept walking. The 8th and 9th miles blurred together into an endless trial of will versus flesh. Jacob's world had narrowed to pure determination. He was no longer thinking about Sarah or promises or love. He was only thinking about the next step. His body had become an enemy he was at war with, and he would not let it win. He had survived 5 years alone in the wilderness, had faced down grizzly bears and mountain lions, had endured injuries and illnesses that would have killed softer men. He would not be defeated by snow and weight and distance. But he was getting dangerously cold now. The shivering that had plagued him earlier had stopped, which was a bad sign. His thinking felt slow, like moving through honey. He kept forgetting why he was out here, and then remembering in a burst of clarity. Sarah, flour, bread, home. The words became a mantra that pulled him forward. He nearly walked past the turnoff to their cabin, so disoriented that he almost missed the distinctive double pine that marked the start of the final mile. Recognition hit him like a slap, jolting him back to fuller awareness. 1 more mile, just 1 more mile. The cabin was right there, just through the trees, just down the slope. Jacob forced his legs to move faster, drawing on reserves he did not know he still had. The snow was not as deep here in the shelter of the trees, and the trail was one he had walked hundreds of times. His body knew the way, even if his mind was foggy. Down past the lightning-struck spruce, around the boulder that looked like a sleeping bear, through the clearing where deer came to graze. And then, through the curtain of falling snow, he saw light, golden and warm and beautiful, spilling from the cabin window like a beacon. Sarah had put a lamp in the window, the way she always did when he was due home, lighting his way through the darkness. The sight of it hit Jacob like a physical blow, emotion surging up through the numbness and exhaustion. She was there. She was waiting. He had made it. The last 100 yards almost finished him. Now that the goal was in sight, his body wanted to quit, wanted to acknowledge that it had done enough. His legs trembled with every step, threatening to buckle. The flour sacks felt like they were pulling him down into the earth. But he could see the cabin clearly now, could see smoke rising from the chimney, and he kept moving through sheer stubborn refusal to fail this close to success. He made it to the porch and set the flour sacks down as carefully as his shaking arms would allow, then stood there swaying, trying to remember what came next. The door. He needed to open the door. His hands fumbled with the latch, fingers too numb and clumsy to grip properly. Then the door flew open, and Sarah was there, her face pale with worry and relief. "Jacob! Oh my God, Jacob!" She grabbed his arm and pulled him inside, and the warmth of the cabin hit him like a wall. His legs finally gave out, and he collapsed, catching himself on the table. Sarah was moving around him frantically, peeling off his frozen outer layers, exclaiming over the state of him. "You are half frozen," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Why did you come through the storm? I told you before you left that if the weather turned bad, you should wait in town. I would have been fine for a few more days." Jacob tried to answer, but his jaw would not work properly. Sarah got him out of his wet things and into the chair by the fire, wrapping him in blankets. She rubbed his hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, making small, worried sounds when she saw how white and cold they were. She heated water and made him drink something hot and sweet, holding the cup to his lips when his hands shook too badly to hold it himself. Gradually, Painfully, warmth began to seep back into his body. Sensation returned to his extremities in burning waves of pins and needles. His mind cleared, the dangerous fog lifting. He became aware of Sarah kneeling beside his chair, her hands gripping his, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I brought flour," he managed to say, his voice coming out as a croak. Sarah let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You fool, you beautiful, stubborn fool. You could have died out there." "I promised," Jacob said. He lifted one hand, still shaking, and touched her face. "I promised you could bake bread." The tears spilled over then, running down Sarah's cheeks. She pressed her face against his hand, kissing his palm. "I do not care about bread. I care about you. If something had happened to you out there, I would have died. Do you understand me? I would have died." Jacob pulled her closer, ignoring the protests from his battered body, and wrapped his arms around her. She climbed into his lap, careful of his injured shoulders, and buried her face against his neck. They sat like that for a long time, holding each other while the fire crackled and the storm raged outside. "I am sorry I worried you," Jacob said finally. "But I'm not sorry I came. You have asked for so little, Sarah. You have never complained about this hard life, never made demands. When I can give you something you want, something that makes you happy, I'm going to do it, no matter what it takes." Sarah pulled back to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "You make me happy, not things, not bread or supplies or anything else. You, just you, coming home safe, that is all I need." "You have me," Jacob said. "You will always have me. But you are going to have flour too, because I just carried 200 pounds of it 10 miles through a blizzard, and I will be damned if we are not going to use it." That startled a laugh out of her, watery but real. She kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of relief. "I love you so much it frightens me sometimes," she whispered against his lips. "I love you too," Jacob said, "more than I knew it was possible to love anyone." They stayed by the fire for another hour while Jacob fully recovered, drinking hot coffee and talking in quiet voices. Sarah told him about the past 3 days alone, about the deer that had come right up to the cabin window, about the book she had been reading by firelight, about the socks she was knitting for him. Jacob told her about the trip to town, about the jobs he had worked, about Henderson trying to convince him to wait out the storm. "He thought I was crazy," Jacob admitted. "Maybe I was. But I kept thinking about you waiting here, kept thinking about the way your face lights up when you bake. It seemed worth the risk." "Nothing is worth risking your life," Sarah said firmly. "Promise me you will not do something like this again. Promise me that next time you will wait, even if it means I have to go without flour for a while longer." Jacob was quiet for a moment, knowing he should make that promise, knowing it was what she needed to hear. But he also knew himself, knew that he would walk through another blizzard or worse if it meant keeping Sarah happy and safe. Instead of lying, he said, "I promise I will always do everything I can to come home to you." Sarah sighed, recognizing the evasion for what it was, but she did not push. She knew who she had married, knew that Jacob's protective nature and stubborn determination were as much a part of him as his brown eyes and strong hands. She would have to accept that he would always be the kind of man who carried flour through blizzards, just as he had to accept that she would always worry when he did. That night, after Jacob had warmed thoroughly and eaten a hot meal, Sarah examined his shoulders by lamplight. The rope had indeed rubbed them raw, leaving angry marks that made her wince. She cleaned the wounds gently with water and applied a salve she made from herbs, her touch tender and careful. Jacob bore it stoically, watching her face as she worked. "You are going to have scars," she said softly. "I have lots of scars," Jacob replied. "What are a few more?" "These are different," Sarah said. "These are from something you chose to do, something you did not have to do." "I did have to do it," Jacob said, "not for survival or duty, but for love. That seems like the best kind of reason for a scar." Sarah's hand stilled, and she looked up at him with such tenderness that it made his chest ache. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "I ask myself the same thing every day," Jacob said, "except I'm asking how I got lucky enough to find you." They made love that night with the storm still raging outside, slow and gentle because of Jacob's battered body, but intense with emotion. Afterwards, they lay tangled together under the quilt Sarah had made, listening to the wind howl and feeling grateful for walls and warmth and each other. "Jacob," Sarah said into the darkness, "I'm almost certain now about the baby." Jacob's arms tightened around her. "How do you feel?" "Terrified," she admitted, "and so happy I could burst. Is that normal?" "I think so," Jacob said. He slid his hand down to rest on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a child." "We are going to have a child," Sarah repeated, wonder in her voice. They talked late into the night about the future, about names they liked and how they would need to add a room to the cabin and whether their baby would have Jacob's dark hair or Sarah's gold. They talked about the kind of parents they wanted to be, about the life they would build for this new person they had created. And as they talked, the storm began to ease, the wind dying down to a whisper, as if even nature was acknowledging that something sacred was happening in this small cabin in the wilderness. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold, the kind of cold that made trees crack and split. But inside the cabin it was warm, and Sarah was making bread. She had been up before dawn, mixing and kneading, her face flushed with pleasure and concentration. By the time Jacob woke, the smell of baking bread filled the small space, rich and yeasty and perfect. Jacob watched from the bed as Sarah worked, amazed as always by how she could take simple ingredients and transform them into something wonderful. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, shaping loaves and placing them in the Dutch oven. Her hair was tied back with a ribbon he had bought for her in town, and she hummed as she worked, a tuneless little melody that meant she was content. When the first loaf came out of the oven, golden brown and steaming, Sarah brought it to him with a look of pure joy. "Try it," she urged. Jacob tore off a piece, ignoring the heat, and bit into it. The bread was perfect, crusty outside and soft inside, with a flavor that was both simple and complex. But what made it truly delicious was knowing what it had cost, knowing that Sarah understood exactly what he had done to make this moment possible. "It is the best bread I have ever tasted," Jacob said honestly. Sarah's smile could have lit the whole territory. "I have enough flour now to bake bread twice a week for months. We can have it with every meal. I can make you rolls for your sandwiches when you go out to check traps. I can make sweet bread with the raisins you brought. I can teach our baby how to bake when the time comes." Jacob pulled her down onto his lap, careful of his sore shoulders, and kissed her thoroughly. "You are going to spoil me." "Good," Sarah said. "You deserve to be spoiled. After what you did yesterday, you deserve everything." They spent the day snowed in, which suited them fine. Jacob rested and recovered while Sarah baked, filling the cabin with loaves of bread that they stored wrapped in cloth. She made regular bread and bread with herbs, rolls, and flatbread, and even a sweet braided loaf that was more treat than sustenance. She was making up for lost time, for all the months she had gone without proper flour, and Jacob was happy to let her. In the afternoon, they went outside together to bring in the flour sacks that Jacob had left on the porch. They had frozen solid overnight, but they were intact and dry thanks to the porch's overhang. Sarah marveled at their weight as Jacob carried them inside one by one. "You carried all 4 of these at once?" she asked, disbelief in her voice. "I did," Jacob confirmed. "For 10 miles?" "For 10 miles?" Sarah shook her head slowly. "I knew you were strong. I've seen you split a cord of wood in an afternoon and carry a buck over your shoulders like it weighed nothing. But this is something else entirely." "Love makes you stronger," Jacob said simply. "I could have carried twice as much if I had to." Over the next few days, as Jacob recovered fully and the snow began to settle, they fell into a new routine. Sarah baked bread every few days, and their meals became richer and more varied. Jacob found himself looking forward to coming inside from his chores, to the smell of baking, to the sight of Sarah Fleury and happy in front of the fire. It was such a small thing, bread, but it had transformed their home in a subtle way, had added a layer of comfort and abundance that changed how everything felt. But more than the bread itself, what mattered was what it represented. It represented Jacob's willingness to go to any length for Sarah's happiness. It represented Sarah's growing confidence that she could ask for things, could express wants and needs without fear of being seen as demanding or ungrateful. It represented their ability to weather hardships together and come out stronger on the other side. As winter deepened and Sarah's pregnancy became undeniable, Jacob found himself thinking often about that journey through the blizzard. It had been brutal and dangerous, and maybe even foolish, but he would do it again in a heartbeat. Because that was what love meant to him, carrying the heavy things so the person you loved did not have to, walking through storms so they could stay warm and safe, making sacrifices that you did not even think of as sacrifices because the reward was so much greater than the cost. Sarah's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months. Her belly swelled gently, and Jacob watched with fascination and protectiveness as his child grew inside her. He became even more attentive than before, doing every heavy chore without being asked, making sure Sarah had plenty of rest and good food. He hunted constantly, bringing home deer and elk and rabbits, and Sarah cooked them into rich stews and roasts that kept her strong. She continued to bake bread through the winter, and the flour Jacob had carried through the blizzard lasted until early March, just as she had predicted. By then, the worst of winter had passed and the trail to town was passable again. Jacob made the trip on a clear day, and this time Sarah came with him, riding the gentler of their 2 horses while Jacob walked alongside. It was her first time out of the valley in months, and she was giddy with the adventure of it. They took their time, stopping often to rest and admire the landscape. The mountains were still snow-covered but beautiful, and the sky was the kind of deep blue that only existed in high altitude. Sarah talked the whole way, pointing out birds and asking Jacob about the places they passed. He answered all her questions, pleased to see her so animated and happy. In town, they were greeted with surprise and delight. The few people who knew them had heard about Jacob's journey through the blizzard from Henderson, and the story had grown in the telling until it was almost mythical. Men looked at Jacob with respect, and women looked at Sarah with envy, and together they represented something that spoke to everyone's deepest hopes, that love could be real and strong and enduring, even in this hard land. They bought more supplies, including another 2 sacks of flour that Jacob carried to their horses with ease, now that he was not walking through a blizzard. They also bought fabric for baby clothes and a cradle that a local carpenter had made. Sarah ran her hands over the smooth wood with tears in her eyes, imagining their child sleeping in it. On the way home, they stopped by the creek where Jacob had proposed. It was running high with snowmelt, loud and vigorous, and the spot where they had sat was now underwater. But they found a dry place nearby and sat together, Sarah leaning back against Jacob's chest, his arms wrapped around her and their unborn child. "Are you happy?" Jacob asked. "I am so happy I cannot put it into words," Sarah said. "Sometimes I lie awake at night afraid that I am going to wake up and discover this was all a dream, that you are not real, that our life together is not real." "I am real," Jacob assured her. "This is real, and it is only going to get better." Sarah tilted her head back to look at him. "How did you become so certain about everything? You never seemed to doubt." Jacob was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer. "I spent a lot of years doubting," he said finally. "Doubting whether I would ever find a place to belong, whether I would ever be more than just another failed rancher's son. But then I met you, and suddenly everything became clear. You are my place to belong. Our family is my purpose. I do not doubt because I finally found the thing worth being certain about." Sarah turned in his arms and kissed him, long and slow and sweet. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "We are going to be good parents," she said. "We are going to give our children everything we did not have." "Yes," Jacob agreed, "we are." They made it home before dark and spent the evening unpacking their purchases and organizing their supplies. Sarah held up the tiny gowns she would sew for the baby, imagining a small person wearing them. Jacob examined the cradle, testing its sturdiness and planning where they would put it. Everything was coming together, building toward the moment when their family would expand from 2 to 3. As spring arrived in earnest, transforming the mountains from white to green almost overnight, Jacob began working on an addition to the cabin. He wanted to add a bedroom for the baby, and eventually more bedrooms for the siblings he hoped would follow. He worked every spare moment, cutting logs and fitting them together with the same care he had used to build the original cabin. Sarah watched him work, her hands resting on her swelling belly, feeling their baby kick and move. She brought him water and food, and sometimes she just sat nearby, content to be in his presence. She understood now that Jacob expressed love through action, that every log he fitted into place was another way of saying, "I love you, I will protect you, I will give you everything I can." In late April, Sarah's labor began on a warm afternoon when the wildflowers were blooming in the meadows and the creek was singing with snowmelt. Jacob had been expecting this, had prepared as best he could, but nothing could have truly prepared him for the reality of watching Sarah in pain. He wanted to fix it, to take the pain away, but all he could do was hold her hand and wipe her brow and tell her she was doing amazingly. The labor was long, lasting through the night and into the next morning. There was no doctor, no midwife, just Jacob and Sarah and the baby fighting to be born. Jacob had helped deliver calves and foals, and he drew on that experience now, talking Sarah through each contraction, encouraging her when she was certain she could not continue. "You can do this," he told her over and over. "You are the strongest person I know. You can do anything." And Sarah, despite her exhaustion and pain, believed him. She drew on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, and when the sun rose on that April morning, she delivered their baby into Jacob's waiting hands. It was a boy, red-faced and squalling, perfect in every way. Jacob cut the cord with shaking hands and wrapped his son in a clean blanket, then placed him on Sarah's chest. Sarah was crying and laughing at the same time, her face exhausted but radiant. Jacob knelt beside the bed, one arm around Sarah and one hand touching his son's tiny head, overcome with emotion too large for words. "We made this," Sarah whispered, her voice full of wonder. "We made a person." "We made the most beautiful person in the world," Jacob said. He kissed Sarah's temple, tasting sweat and tears. "You are incredible. You are incredible." They named him Daniel Jacob Thornton, and he was everything they had dreamed of, and more. He had a shock of dark hair like his father and his mother's delicate features. His eyes, when he opened them, were the deep blue of all newborns, and both parents were eager to see what color they would eventually become. The first weeks with Daniel were both exhausting and transcendent. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, but he still needed constant care. Sarah was recovering from the birth and learning to nurse, and Jacob took on every other task, from cooking to cleaning to washing endless diapers. He did it all without complaint, driven by love for his wife and son. Sarah, for her part, was transformed by motherhood. She had always been loving and kind, but now those qualities deepened and expanded. She spent hours just gazing at Daniel, memorizing his tiny features, marveling at his existence. She sang to him constantly, lullabies her own mother had sung to her, and Jacob would often stop what he was doing just to listen. As Daniel grew from newborn to infant, the cabin rang with new sounds, baby laughter, baby cries, baby babbles. Jacob would come in from working on the addition to find Sarah sitting in the rocking chair he had made, nursing Daniel, or simply holding him while he slept. The sight of them together never failed to stop him in his tracks, to remind him of everything he had and everything he had to lose. One evening in June, when Daniel was about 6 weeks old, Sarah made bread for the first time since giving birth. She'd been too busy and too tired before, but now she felt ready to reclaim that part of herself. She placed Daniel in his cradle where she could see him and set to work, her hands remembering the familiar motions of mixing and kneading. Jacob came in from finishing the roof on the new bedroom to find her flowery and happy, the way he remembered, with the smell of yeast and warmth filling the cabin. Daniel was cooing and waving his little fists, and Sarah was talking to him as she worked, explaining what she was doing as if he could understand. "I'm making bread, sweet boy," she said. "Just like your papa brought me flour for, walking all the way through a blizzard because he loves us so much. Someday you will understand what that means, that your father is the kind of man who walks through blizzards carrying heavy loads just to make the people he loves happy. Someday you will want to be that kind of man too." Jacob stood in the doorway, unnoticed, with tears in his eyes. He had thought that carrying the flour through the blizzard had been about Sarah, about keeping a promise and providing for his wife. But now he understood it was bigger than that. It was about creating a home, a real home, where children grew up safe and loved and surrounded by small comforts like fresh bread. It was about showing his son, even before he was born, what love looked like in action. Sarah turned and saw him there, and her face softened. "Come here," she said. Jacob crossed to her and pulled her into his arms, careful not to disturb the flour on her hands. She leaned into him, her head on his chest, and they stood like that while Daniel made happy noises from his cradle. I have been thinking," Sarah said, "about that day you walked through the blizzard." "What about it?" I was angry at you at first, remember? Angry and scared because you had risked your life. But I understand now. You were not just bringing me flour. You were building something. You were showing me, showing us what kind of family we were going to be. We are a family where people take care of each other, Jacob said, where we carry heavy loads for each other, where we walk through storms if that is what it takes. Yes, Sarah agreed, and I want Daniel to grow up knowing that. I want him to grow up seeing you carry heavy things and knowing that is what love looks like. Not pretty words or empty gestures, but real action, real sacrifice. He will know, Jacob promised. We will both show him. The bread that night was even more delicious than usual, or maybe it just tasted that way because of what it represented. They ate it with butter and honey, Daniel sleeping peacefully nearby, and talked about the future, about how they would add more bedrooms to the cabin for the brothers and sisters they hoped Daniel would have, about how Jacob would teach his son to trap and hunt and survive in the wilderness, about how Sarah would teach him to read and bake and be kind. As summer advanced into its full glory, Jacob finished the addition and started planning more improvements. He wanted to build a barn for their animals, a larger garden for Sarah, maybe even a workshop where he could do woodworking in the winter. Every project was about building up their homestead, making it more secure and comfortable and abundant. Daniel thrived, growing chubby and happy. He started sleeping through the night, much to Sarah's relief, and began to recognize his parents with smiles and coos. Jacob was completely besotted with his son, spending every free moment playing with him, talking to him, carrying him around the cabin and showing him things as if a 3-month-old could understand. One afternoon in August, Jacob was out in the meadow cutting hay when he heard Sarah calling his name with urgency. He dropped the scythe and ran back to the cabin, his heart pounding with fear. He burst through the door expecting disaster, but found Sarah standing by the cradle with tears streaming down her face and a huge smile. "He rolled over," she said. "Jacob, Daniel just rolled over from his back to his stomach all by himself." Jacob's fear transformed instantly into joy. He crossed to the cradle and looked down at his son, who was indeed on his stomach, looking surprised and pleased with himself. "That is my boy," Jacob said, his voice thick with pride. "You're getting so strong." They spent the rest of the afternoon taking turns, encouraging Daniel to roll over again, celebrating each success like it was the greatest achievement in human history. Later, Sarah would laugh at how ridiculous they must have seemed, two grown adults losing their minds over a baby's basic developmental milestone. But in the moment, it was not ridiculous at all. It was watching their child grow and change, watching him become more of a person every day. As fall approached and the aspens turned gold in the high country, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. The news came sooner than they had expected, but it was welcome all the same. Daniel would be just over a year old when his sibling arrived, which meant they would be close in age, hopefully close in friendship. "We are going to have our hands full," Sarah said, but she was smiling. "Good," Jacob replied. "I always wanted a big family." That winter was easier than the previous one, both because they were more prepared and because their routine was more established. Jacob made the trip to town once a month, and each time he brought back 2 sacks of flour without fail. He never again had to walk through a blizzard carrying them, but even on clear days, he remembered that journey, remembered what it had taught him about commitment and love, and the lengths he would go to for his family. Sarah baked bread regularly, and Daniel, now old enough to sit up and watch, loved the process. He would bang on his tray and babble happily while Sarah worked, and she would give him bits of dough to play with. Jacob would come in from working outside to find them both covered in flour, and the sight always made him laugh. Their second child, a girl they named Emma Rose, was born in May during a thunderstorm that shook the cabin. Daniel, now 13 months old, slept through the entire labor, oblivious to the drama. Emma was smaller than Daniel had been, but just as healthy, with a cap of golden hair that suggested she would take after her mother. Sarah recovered more quickly this time, perhaps because she knew what to expect, and within a few weeks was back to her normal routine, just with 2 babies instead of 1. Life was chaotic and beautiful and exhausting. Jacob and Sarah moved through their days in a constant state of motion, caring for the babies, maintaining the cabin and homestead, trying to find moments for each other amid the demands of parenthood. But they never forgot why they were doing it, never lost sight of the love that had started everything. On the first anniversary of his blizzard journey, Jacob woke early and went to where they stored the flour. He brought 2 50-pound sacks into the main room and set them down in front of the fire, then woke Sarah gently. "What are you doing?" she asked, confused and sleepy. "1 year ago today, I carried 4 of these through a blizzard," Jacob said. "I wanted to remember that. Wanted us to remember what we are capable of when we love each other." Sarah got out of bed and came to stand beside him, looking down at the flour sacks. Then she looked up at her husband, this strong, stubborn, beautiful man who had walked through hell to bring her something simple and necessary. She put her arms around his waist and held him tight. "I remember," she said. "I remember every day. Every time I bake bread, every time I look at our children, every time I wake up in this cabin we built together. I remember that you are the kind of man who carries heavy things through storms, and I try to be the kind of woman who deserves that." "You are," Jacob said fiercely. "You are everything. You and Daniel and Emma. You are my whole world." They stood there holding each other while the sun rose outside, while their children slept peacefully, while the mountains stood eternal and indifferent all around them. They had built something precious in this wilderness, something that would last long after they were gone. They had built a family founded on sacrifice and devotion, on the willingness to carry heavy loads for each other. As the years passed, the story of Jacob's journey became part of their family legend. Daniel and Emma grew up hearing about how their father had carried 200 pounds of flour 10 miles through a blizzard just so their mother could bake bread. As they got older and understood what that truly meant, they came to see it as a defining characteristic of their parents' love. More children followed: Thomas in 1881, Lucy in 1883, Samuel in 1885. The cabin grew with them, expanding room by room as Jacob continued his endless building. The homestead became more established, more prosperous. They added chickens and a milk cow, expanded the garden, built a proper barn. Life was still hard, but it was also rich with meaning and purpose. Sarah never stopped baking bread. Even when her children were grown and she was well into middle age, she baked at least twice a week, filling their home with that wonderful smell. And every time she did, she thought about the flour and the blizzard and the man who had loved her enough to risk everything. Jacob's body bore the marks of that journey for the rest of his life. The scars on his shoulders never fully faded, and sometimes in winter they would ache with the memory of cold and weight. But he wore them proudly, considered them badges of honor. They reminded him of who he was and what he valued. They reminded him that love was not just a feeling, but an action, something you did rather than something you merely felt. On their 20th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party. All 5 were there, ranging from Daniel at 19 to Samuel at 13, along with Daniel's new wife and the grandchild Sarah was expecting. They gathered in the large cabin that had grown over the years to accommodate them all, and they ate bread that Sarah had baked that morning. At one point, Daniel stood up to make a toast. He had grown into a man much like his father, tall and strong with the same quiet intensity. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that love means carrying heavy things for each other, who showed us that family is built through sacrifice and devotion, and who proved that the smallest gesture, like bringing home flour so someone can bake bread, can mean everything when it is done with a full heart." Jacob looked at Sarah across the table, and in her eyes he saw the same girl he had met 22 years ago outside the general store. She was older now, her golden hair streaked with silver, her face lined with laughter and worry. But she was still beautiful, still the center of his world. She smiled at him, and he knew she was thinking the same thing he was. They had done well. They had built something that would last. After the party, when the children had gone home or to bed, Jacob and Sarah sat together on the porch they had built 5 years ago. It was June, and the night was warm, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant call of an owl. Above them, the stars blazed in the clear mountain air. "Do you remember what you said to me when you proposed?" Sarah asked. "I said a lot of things," Jacob replied, "most of them clumsy and awkward. You said you would work every day to make me happy, that you would protect me with everything you had, that you would build me a home and fill it with everything I needed." "I remember," Jacob said. "It seems like a lifetime ago." "You kept every promise," Sarah said. She took his hand, their fingers interlacing naturally after so many years. "Every single one. You built me a home and filled it with children and love. You worked every day to make me happy, and you protected me even when the danger was just my own disappointment or loneliness. It was easy, Jacob said. Loving you has been the easiest thing I have ever done. Carrying 200 pounds of flour through a blizzard was easy? Jacob laughed. That was hard, but it was still easy because the reason behind it was so clear. You wanted bread. I could get you flour. Therefore, I would get you flour no matter what it took. Simple. Nothing about you is simple, Sarah said, but she was smiling. You are the most complicated, wonderful, stubborn man I have ever known. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. Jacob thought about the journey his life had taken, from lonely mountain man to husband and father. He thought about all the choices that had led him here, to this porch with this woman beside him, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would not change a single thing. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had never met? Sarah asked. No, Jacob said immediately. I do not wonder because I cannot imagine it. You are as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. Taking you away would unmake me completely. That's how I feel too, Sarah said softly, like we were always meant to find each other. Like everything before we met was just preparation for our life together. Maybe it was, Jacob said. Maybe the universe knew that somewhere there was a woman who needed flour carried through a blizzard, and somewhere there was a man strong enough and stubborn enough to do it. Sarah laughed, the sound light and young despite her years. Of all the things you have done for me, you are never going to let me forget that flour, are you? Never, Jacob confirmed. It is my finest achievement. Your finest achievement is our children, Sarah corrected, our family, this life we built. All of that came from the flour, Jacob said, grinning now. Without the flour, there would have been no bread. Without the bread, you would have been disappointed. Without proving I would do anything for you, you might have doubted my love. So really, everything traces back to those 4 sacks and that blizzard. You are impossible, Sarah said, but she was laughing too. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat there together watching the night, 2 people who had chosen each other and built a life through love and hard work and the willingness to carry heavy burdens. As they aged, the story of the flour and the blizzard became a sort of touchstone for their children and grandchildren. Whenever life got hard, whenever someone was facing a difficult choice or a painful sacrifice, they would remember Grandpa Jacob carrying flour through the snow. They would remember that love was not about grand gestures or perfect romance, but about showing up, doing the hard things, carrying the heavy loads. Daniel told the story to his own children, and Thomas told it to his, and on down through the generations. It became part of the family mythology, the kind of story that defined who they were and what they valued. And though the details might have changed slightly with each telling, the core truth remained. Jacob had loved Sarah enough to risk everything for something as simple as flour for bread. Jacob lived to be 73 years old, his body finally giving out after decades of hard use. He died in the cabin he had built with his own hands, surrounded by children and grandchildren, with Sarah holding his hand. His last words were to her, "I would do it again. All of it, every day." Sarah lived another 5 years after Jacob's death, and those years were hard despite being surrounded by family. She had been with Jacob for 50 years, and without him, the world felt incomplete. But she continued to bake bread, continued to tell stories about the man who had walked through a blizzard for her, continued to pass on the lessons their life together had taught. On what would have been their 55th wedding anniversary, Sarah made bread one last time. Her hands were old and gnarled now, and the work was harder than it used to be, but she persevered. When the loaves came out of the oven, golden and perfect, she broke off a piece and ate it slowly, remembering. She remembered the first time Jacob had brought her flour, remembered the look on his face when he stumbled through the door half frozen. She remembered 20 years of baking bread in the cabin they had built together, of feeding it to their children and grandchildren. She remembered how something as simple as flour and yeast and water could become a symbol of love and devotion. That night, Sarah died peacefully in her sleep, and her children found her in the morning with a smile on her face. They buried her next to Jacob on the hill overlooking the cabin under the aspens that had stood witness to their entire life together. The cabin still stands today, occupied now by a great-great-grandson and his family. In the kitchen, hanging on the wall, is a framed piece of cloth with words embroidered by one of Sarah's daughters. He carried flour through a blizzard so she could bake bread. Below it is a picture of Jacob and Sarah on their wedding day, young and hopeful and ready to build a life together. The family still tells the story, passing it down to each new generation. They tell it because it reminds them where they came from, reminds them that their family was built on a foundation of sacrifice and devotion. They tell it because in a world that often seems cold and difficult, it is good to remember that love can be as simple and necessary as bringing someone flour so they can bake bread. And sometimes, when snow falls thick in the mountains and the wind howls through the passes, the current inhabitants of the cabin look out at the white wilderness and think about their ancestor Jacob walking through conditions just like these with 200 pounds of flour on his shoulders. They think about what it must have taken, the strength and determination and love, and they feel grateful. Grateful for his sacrifice, for the family he built, for the legacy he left behind. Because in the end, that is what matters. Not the grand gestures or the dramatic moments, but the everyday acts of love. The willingness to carry heavy things for the people who matter. The determination to walk through storms, literal or metaphorical, to make sure your loved ones have what they need. The understanding that love is not passive, but active, not just a feeling, but a series of choices made over and over again. Jacob understood that instinctively. He understood that promising to love someone meant promising to show up, to do the hard work, to carry the heavy loads. And he kept that promise every day for 50 years, from the moment he carried flour through a blizzard until the moment he drew his last breath. Sarah understood it too. She understood that accepting Jacob's love meant accepting that she was worth sacrificing for, worth protecting, worth the effort. And she spent her life trying to be worthy of that devotion, loving Jacob just as fiercely in her own way, building a home and raising children and creating a legacy that would outlast them both. Together, they proved that love can survive anything: poverty, isolation, hardship, the endless challenges of frontier life. They proved that two people who choose each other, who commit to carrying life's burdens together, can build something beautiful and lasting. They proved that the smallest act of devotion, carried out with a full heart, can echo through generations. Their great-great-grandson, standing now in the kitchen of the old cabin, takes a piece of bread from the fresh loaf his wife has baked. The recipe is the same one Sarah used over a century ago, passed down through the family along with the story. He chews slowly, thinking about history and love and legacy. Outside, snow is beginning to fall, dusting the mountains white. His wife comes to stand beside him at the window, their daughter playing on the floor behind them. He puts his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Do you think you would have done it?" she asks, knowing he will understand what she means. He thinks about it seriously, imagining himself walking through a blizzard carrying 200 pounds. It seems impossible, beyond human endurance. But then he looks at his wife and daughter, thinks about what he would do to protect them and provide for them, and suddenly it does not seem impossible at all. "Yes," he says with certainty. "I would have done it, just like he did. Because that is what love means in this family. We carry the heavy things. We walk through the storms. We show up no matter what it costs." His wife smiles and kisses his cheek, and they stand together watching the snow fall, feeling the weight of history and love all around them. In this cabin, in this place, the story continues. The legacy endures. And somewhere, perhaps Jacob and Sarah are watching, satisfied that the lessons they taught through their life together are still being learned, still being passed on, still shaping the lives of their descendants. Because in the end, that is immortality. Not living forever yourself, but creating something that will outlast you. Not being remembered for great deeds, but for simple acts of love carried out with devotion. Not monuments or fame, but children and grandchildren who know what love looks like in action. Jacob Thornton carried 4 sacks of flour 10 miles through a blizzard so his wife could bake bread. It was a simple act, born of love and necessity, carried out without thought of recognition or reward. But it became the foundation of a family, the symbol of a marriage, the legacy of a life well lived. And more than a century later, it still matters, it still teaches, it still inspires. Because love is not about the easy moments or the perfect days. Love is about carrying heavy things through storms. Love is about showing up when it is hard. Love is about choosing every day to put someone else's needs and happiness before your own comfort. Jacob knew this, Sarah knew this, and they built a life, a family, and a legacy on this foundation. They proved that even in the hardest circumstances, even in a wilderness that seemed designed to break people, love could not just survive but thrive. They proved that two people committed to each other could create something beautiful and lasting. And they did it all starting with 4 sacks of flour, a blizzard, and a man who loved his wife enough to walk through hell to see her smile. That was their story. That was their gift to the future. That was their proof that love, real love, can endure anything and build everything. The snow continues to fall outside the cabin, covering the mountains in white, just as it did over a century ago. But inside there is warmth and light and love, just as there was then. The family continues, the story endures, and the lesson remains true. Love is measured not in words but in actions, not in promises but in sacrifices, not in what we say but in what we are willing to carry.